Absent, maybe he joined sometime later. Okay, so bone is the hardest part which is involved in your movements. Okay, but it has variable properties because its composition is not uniform. Basically, there are two tissues types we have in the bones. One is spongy type and one is hard. There are technical names to them. I'll discuss all of them. So because of variable composition, it has variable biomechanical properties, variable ability to handle stresses, variable abilities to handle different kinds of forces. So all these things will be discussed in this lecture regarding biomechanics of bones. So first of all, first slide will tell you what are the main functions of bones in your system, why they are present, what is the main functions. So let the slide change. Yeah, so they protect your vital organs include your brain, heart, lungs, all soft tissue, soft organs which are very important for your physiology, for a normal homeostasis. So उनके protection के लिए you need something, a structure which can help them because they are very delicate. So this protective structure is provided by your bones. They provide rigidity to your body. A solid thing which you have in your body is your bones only. Rest are very soft tissue, and for the protection purposes, bones are there, and they are in the form of skeleton so that you can have proper form, proper shape to your body. Third point, it provides attachments for the muscles, levers, so that they can function as a mechanical lever. That is the simplest mechanical machine. Bones are there, they are acting as a lever. Then joints are there, they are the part of that lever. So and they are providing attachments for the muscles, tendons, so that our whole system can be formed and you can produce force, you can utilize force, you can utilize different physical principles to your advantage. Number fourth point is a physiological point. It is the manufacturing place of your blood cells by bone marrow. I am saying in the bone marrow, if you know a little bit of physiology, you must be knowing. So all these blood cells are formed via bones, and that spongy part, there this process happens. And it is last point, it is a storehouse of minerals, calcium, like that. It is provided by this. So these are the key points about the bones. You should have always in mind what is the purpose of bones. So these are the main physiological or structural functions mainly of your bones. Now coming to the composition. Good afternoon, Shivu. He has joined. Okay, all are present today. Good. So bone composition in the next slide. So here I am describing you about the what is bone composed of mainly. It is mainly composed of collagen, fibers, and bone cells. Bone cells are called osteocytes. So these are the three main components of bones, and it is basically remodeled throughout your life. This is very important point. Your bones get remodeled means it get renewed. These old cells get renewed by new ones, and this process continues throughout your life. And any alteration in this process of bone remodeling can hamper your normal system, because अगर ये ज़्यादा होगा, excess of bone remodeling will make your bones weak. अगर excess में होता है, if it is on the other side, that is also harmful. So it should be perfectly there, perfectly normal form, perfect control should be there on this process. So bone is actually constructed and remodeled throughout your life by special bone cells which are known as osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And the two main bone tissues which actually divide these into two bone types, are cortical bone and cancellous bone. Cortical bone and cancellous bone. Cancellous bone is also known as spongy bone. Now we will discuss all these two main types. These are main tissues of which your bones are composed of. So let's switch to cortical bone first. So I'm not going to in the deep details. I am just telling you the main points which you should know as a in the biomechanics, which is useful in terms of physical principles, in terms of biomechanics. So I'm telling you only those points. Otherwise, we can talk full on one cortical bone only. So that is not the aim. Aim is just to make you familiar about the bone tissues and how they are related to biomechanics. Okay, so right now I'm just giving you the main points which are required, which you should know for studying the biomechanics of bones. Okay, so the first bone, cortical bone, is the tissue, and this is the basically harder part. Harder outer layer of bones is composed of cortical bone, and it is also known as compact bone. This is another name of cortical bone, and it is much denser than cancellous or spongy bone. That is the other part. Okay, other type, and it forms the hard part of your bones, and it is present. If we tell you the percentage, 80% of the total bone mass in your skeleton in an adult is made up of cortical bone, and it facilitates main functions of the strength functions. It provides you strength, it protects organs. So it is the material which provides you that hardness in your bones. Okay, cortical bone tissue. And so it also stores calcium for the metabolism part and release chemical elements like calcium. And what is the functional unit of this? Function unit means the smallest unit which functions, and it is given in the diagram on the right hand side, the one which is protruding out. So that is known as osteon. These are the functional unit of cortical bone. So important point to remember here is that this is the hardest part of your bone, and it is there where you require strength, and it forms 80% of your skeleton. Bone mass in your skeleton is formed by this type of bone tissue. Okay, and the function unit is osteon. Now coming to the cancellous bone, and in the central part is the spongy. It is on the outer layers. Okay, now coming to spongy or the cancellous bone. Let the slide change and you will see. So cancellous bone is also known as spongy bone, and it is also known as trabecular bone. It is the internal tissue, basically the soft part of your skeletal bone, and it is basically a porous network. It has higher surface to area volume ratio is higher in it, and another important point is it is not as dense as your cortical bone is. So it is softer on. It is less dense. So it is on the weaker side, but it is more of flexible, and it is highly vascular. That means a lot of blood supply, जितनी भी आपकी blood supply है, is through this tissue only. It is highly vascular, and it is the place where bone marrow is present, and the process of hematopoiesis, which is the process of bone blood cell formation, happens here. Okay, and the cancellous bone accounts for remaining 20% of your bone mass. 80% is by cortical bone, rest 20% is by cancellous bone, and the functional unit here is known as trabecula. So these are the points you should remember about both the types. Okay, now coming to the types on the next slide. What are the types of bone on the basis of they look or the basis of their shapes? So mainly they are divided into 5 types. So here you can see the picture skeleton, and I have, and this picture clearly shows you different types of bone they have segregated from the main. So the first one is the flat bone, and it is mainly present in the skull. Okay, flat bone. Second type is short bone. These are very short cube shaped bones, and these are mainly present in your wrist, hands, ankles, foot bones, which are very small. Then Sesamoid bone is a special type of bone which is present in between your tendon. It is located a little bit inside. Patella is the example. So I'll discuss all of them one by one in a very brief and to the point way. And the fourth type is irregular bone, which has no shape at all. It is irregular in shape, so that's why we the name has been given like irregular bone. And last one is the long bones. So these are the main five types. Okay, now we'll discuss all of them one by one. Not so in great depth, just an overview so that you understand what are the key differences between these types. Okay, so the first one is your long bones. So long bones, as you all know, these are present mainly in your limbs, basically limbs or fingers, toes. So all have these structure. So it is lengthy in structure, and the length part is known as diaphysis. The shaft is basically technically known as diaphysis, and the terminal parts that are, which are rounded are known as epiphysis. So a rounded head at each end of the shaft you can see here, and the long bone. So mostly it is made up of compact bone, and the shaft basically, the diaphysis is mainly composed of that hard part, compact bone. On the terminal ends, like on the epiphysis, you have that soft bone where bone marrow is present and the blood cells forms. So this is the main structure, key points we should know, and examples I have already given you. So these are basically present in your limbs, fingers, and toes. So that's about long bones. Now coming to the short bones on the next slide. So good afternoon, Neha. Neha is also joined. So short bones are basically roughly in the shape of cubes. You can see here, they are cube shaped and have only a thin layer of compact bone and surrounding spongy interior, the spongy bone tissue. And examples are they are present in the wrist, in your ankle. So these are the examples of short bones. So that much you should know in the biomechanics. Then coming to the third type, flat bones. So flat bones are the third type, which are usually very thin, and these are the flat bones which I have shown you in the picture below. Cranial bones, it is in your sternum. So these kind of bones are characteristic. Main characteristic is that they are very thin and usually have some curvature, generally curved, with two parallel layers of compact bones, sandwiching a layer of spongy bone. So on the both side, like a sandwich, they have a that hard bone part, and in between they have spongy bone. So mostly they represent the skull, sternum. So these are all ribs. These are all examples of flat bones. Okay. Now coming to a special type of bone, which is very less in number in the if you compare with other types, that is known as sesamoid bones. So sesamoid bones are embedded in tendons. They are embedded. They are just inside. You can see the red arrow. That round part is your sesamoid bone. Patella it is. Okay. And since they basically how they help, they have some advantage of muscle movement. How? Basically focus on the second point, they act to hold the tendon further away from the joint, so they make some gap between joint and the tendon is the uh, elastic tissue which will join muscle with the bone. So this bone helps to create a distance certain, so that angle of the tendon is little bit increased. So what is the advantage of this? When this angles get increased, your muscle get advantage of movement and contraction and relaxation. So in this way it sometimes help, has some advantage, provided some advantage to the muscles. sesamoid bones, and examples are patella and pisiform. Now the last type is irregular bones, the bones which have no regular shape. And right side you can see the example. So they do not fit into any of the above categories. So that's why they are irregular. They have no any perfect shape, so they have made the name like irregular bones. They don't fit in any of the earlier categories. They also consist of a thin layers of compact bone surrounded by a spongy interior. Thin layers of compact bone surrounded by a spongy interior. So spongy interior is always in the inside of your bone. Always keep in mind. You have seen different types. In all of the types, the spongy bone is always on interior, and your hard bone tissue is on the outer side. And the bones of spine, pelvis are some of the examples of irregular bones, and specific names are sphenoid and ichthyoid. So these are different types of bones you have in your skeleton, and some examples I have shown you, and some features I have told you. That much you should know about each bone type. Now coming to main part, biomechanics of bone. What are the main features? What are the properties we should keep in mind when we are talking of biomechanics with regard to bone? Okay, so this slide will tell you some features of bone. So up till now you know that bone provides a frame to keep your body supported, and it is an attach. It provides attachments for your muscles, tendons, ligaments, and joints. So this is whole system, skeletal system you already learned up till now. So these muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, all they function together to generate force and to transfer the force. So here the we have now started biomechanics coming in. So all these work in coordination, and bones provide the attachment points, and all together form a system which will help you to generate force. And main key player in the generation of force is muscle, you all know. And then transfer part, tendons are there which will help you to transfer the energies and do the stretch shortening cycle, which we already discussed in detail in the previous lectures. So all this system work together to generate force and transfer force, so that individual body parts can be manipulated by the person in three dimensions, so that we can, simply it means we can, so that we can make movements in all the three dimensions. For movements you need force, and force is produced by these things, and transfer of force helps you to become more efficient. So this is the way this skeleton works. Now third point will tell you about some biomechanical properties about strength. Now as you all know, bone has variable parts, means they have different densities at different areas, because on inside it is soft, little bit spongy bone is there, on the outside it is harder. So because of these variability in the properties of the bone composition, bone has variable strengths. They have different kinds of strengths. So mainly three are we have to focus. So the first one is compressive strength, and in bones it is of 170 megapascal. So please remember it. So it is for your reference. So you should have some idea. The compressive strength of bone kitni hai. So it is in the range of this 170 megapascal. So what is the meaning of this compressive strength? And it is highest in the bone. Compressive strength, bones have great, or you can say highest compressive strength. That means if you compress the bone, they can resist it well up to a point. Means अगर आपकी जो forces हैं compressive हैं, then there are very less chance of the bone to break or to get fracture. So bone has highest compressive strength, and the value is 170 megapascals. Now poor tensile strength, poor in comparison to compressive strength. Tensile क्या होता है, जब आपको bone को खिंचाव वाला stress आएगा, when pulling is there, and pulling is most of the cases in our system is by muscles. When you extensively use your muscle to pull your bones in some certain overtraining or something like that, so that leads to problems, and that is known as tensile strength, and it is poor as compared to compressive strength. It is in the middle basically. Highest is your compressive strength. At number 2 you have tensile strength, and the value is around 104 to 121 megapascal. And the bone is weakest on this shear stress. Bone cannot withstand shear stresses at all because it has poor strength with regard to shear stress. It is just 51.6 megapascals. So if the forces or the stress is of shear type, shear means torsional stress, bending forces like that, which you usually see in fast games, in hockey, or you're during sprinting, you have all these forces. So these forces can fracture your bone very easily because bones have poor shear strength. So I repeat, bone has very excellent compressive strength. Number 2, it has tensile strength, and at number 3, it has this shear strength, which is very poor. So this means that bone resists pushing forces. It can resist well because it has good compression strength. Number 2, it cannot withstand your pulling stress, but comparatively, as compared to the shear stress, it can withstand to some extent, and it is weakest in the case of shear stress. I think it is clear now. So your bone is at number 1 at your compressive strength, number 2 at tensile strength, and poor at shear stress. Now the next graphic will make it more clear what kind of stresses I am talking about. Please focus on the figure on the next slide. So this picture will become very clear in your minds what I am talking about the strengths. Yeah. So when we apply stress, we call it technically loading of bone. Okay. So the first figure you can see, when the forces are on compression side, they are pushing it from above or from below. So in this case, bone has very good strength. So there are very less chance of fracture in this case. Then comes tension when muscle pulls your bone. So in this case, our bones are at number 2. So fracture can happen, but it is in the middle. Now coming all last three, shear, torsion, bending. All these types of forces we come across in your games, in sports. And so this is shear force coming to the transverse side from the opposite. It can break your bone because shear stress is poor. These are other parts of same shear stresses. This is torsion, mean twisting. When you twist suddenly with a great force, that can break your bone. And these are bending stress on your. So all these three are there, which can cause fractures in you. And these are because these kind of fractures are common because bones have poor shear strength, and you will hardly see any fracture due to compression or due to tension are there some to some extent, but you hardly see any case of fracture due to compression. And most common cases of fractures are due to these three shear stresses: shear, torsion, and bending. So I hope it is clear, the fracture part and strengths. It will become more clear on in the later slides when we talk of some curves. So in the next slide, I have given you some idea about the fractures in short, which we have discussed till now. So what are bone fractures? In normal bone, fracture occur when there is significant force applied or a repetitive trauma for a longer time. So fractures happen most when you are applying shear stresses, and further properties are it should be repetitive or it should have very good amount. That means it should have very high magnitude. Then it will lead to bone fracture. Second point is due to some disease state or pathological states when you have weak bones. So there are two cases of in human physiology when you have weak bones. One is your disease known as osteoporosis. It is usually found in at old age where your density becomes less and your bones become weak, so they lose all these kind of strengths also. So fracture can happen very easily. due to osteoporosis. And second case is you have some problem in your system. It could be structural problem where your remodeling is not regulated well. And very good example of this remodeling thing is when you go to space. A normal person, if goes to space, astronauts, I'm talking about astronauts, they usually have this problem because in the space their bone loss increases because this process becomes excessively high. So that can also lead to frequent fractures. So there also biomechanics works somehow. I have to discuss this point with you in the first day of our meeting, because biomechanics is not limited to sports. It is very vast field. It is applied to medical field, it is applied to mechanics, it is applied to your, I have discussed all those points, so this is just time again a review of for that. So this is all about bone fractures and what are the causes. Now coming to stress strain curve in the next slide. So let the slide change and on your screens. Yes. So on the left hand side, you can see this is stress basically. What is stress? Force per unit area. So the thing which I am showing in the previous slides, that forces when compressive stress is there, longitude tensile stress is there, shear stress. So what is that stress biomechanically? It is basically force per unit area. Okay. And on the other hand, right hand side, you can see the effects of this stress. Stress leads to deformation, and deformation is in the form of change in length, change in dimension, change in angle. So please focus on the left side. So this is the tensile stress, the arrow is on the upside. Okay, when it is from the left hand side, this is the shear stress that can lead to fractures. So these are different kind of stresses which I have already discussed in the previous. So this is the pictorial representation how stress happens. And on the right hand side, now you can see different strains. Strain is change in the length. When you apply tensile, the excessive lengthening happens. And on the in deep last figure, you can see the bending is happening. So stress is force per unit area and it will lead to strain. And what is strain? Strain is basically change in length, change in angle, or from the as compared to original, it will have some difference. So that will lead to deformation. So now we'll discuss the stress strain curve in the next slide. So now you understand what is stress and what is strain, and you also know now different strengths of the bone. Now please focus on the next slide, which is just coming about stress strain curve. So this is very important with regard to bone biomechanics. You should know this in good amount of detail. So this is now in front of you, we have stress versus strain curve. It is also known as load versus deformation. It is also known as load because stress or load is force per unit area. So it is also known as force. On the x-axis we have deformation. It is also known as length. So there are multiple names for this curve. The thing is same. I repeat, in front of you, you are seeing stress versus strain. This is number first definition, first title. It is also known as load versus deformation. Number three, it is also known as force versus length, because stress is basically force per unit area and strain is basically change in length. So in this way, there are three names for this curve. You should know all of these three. That thing is same. So now I'll discuss in bit detail what is this. So when you plot stress, any force per unit area, different amount of stresses, and stresses in the pascals basically. Okay, and on the x-axis we have strain in the length. So here you can see two regions, and this point which I have just marked right now, y point, is it is called in the form y point, and this is known as yield point. So let it come on your screens also. Yeah, so this point which I marked is known as yield point. So in this curve up to this point, Y point which I have shown, where I have marked. So you can see the curve is almost straight. So this region is known as elastic region. So what is the meaning of this? The meaning is that if you have applied stress in this limit, within this limit, within elastic limit, then bone can go back to its original position. It is just like an elastic. Think of rubber band. Rubber band, when you stretch it, it can go back to its original position. Okay. So up to this point, bone will act as a, this bone will have this property, but up to this point only, up to Y. After this is known as plastic region, and this means permanent deformation. If your stress crosses this line beyond Y, then it will lead to permanent disruption of your bone. Beyond Y, bone cannot restore to its original position. Okay, this please keep in mind. So I again repeat, up to Y point, Y is known as yield point. So yield is the imaginary point which differentiate the curves between the elastic region and the plastic region. So if you apply the stress up to this point, then there are chances that your chances there the bone can get back to its original position or original structure. But if you cross that stress, you go beyond this Y point, then permanent damage will happen, and then the region which is known as, we call it as plastic damage, and this region will come. Now this region has also limit up to this point, and if you go beyond this, then fracture will happen. And usually in the bones, this point is very short. As you cross yield point, it will come very soon, and your bone will get fracture. Okay, so I think it is clear now what is stress strain curve. It is between the stress and strain, and it has Y, an imaginary point where it will differentiate the curve between elastic region and plastic region. The stress is up to within this point up to Y, yield point, we call it as yield point. The stress up to yield point will allow the bone to get restored to its original position, original shape. But if you क्रॉस दैट पॉइंट, अगर आप वाई से ऊपर जाते हैं, स्ट्रेस इतना बढ़ा देते हैं जो वाई को क्रॉस कर जाता है, देन यू विल परमानेंटली डिफॉर्म योर बोन्स, और वो रीजन आपको मिल कहेंगे प्लास्टिक रीजन, एंड बोन इज नोन एज प्लास्टिकली डिफॉर्म्ड. अब इसका भी एक सर्टेन लिमिट है. अप टू दिस लिमिट इट विल सर्वाइव, आफ्टर दैट इट विल ब्रेक. तो जिस ऑब्जेक्ट, ये दिस कर्व इज अप्लाइड टू ऑल थिंग्स इन विच इज प्रेजेंट इन आवर वर्ल्ड. इट इज नॉट जस्ट फॉर बोन. जो कोई भी मटेरियल वी हैव, if we plot this curve, so different material will behave differently. किसी में plastic region बहुत ज़्यादा होगा, and those objects are known as ductile. जैसे प्लास्टिक की चीज़ें होती हैं वो डिफॉर्म करते जाते हैं, वो आप खींचते जाओ उसको कुछ वो टूटता नहीं है. ओके, नाउ इन द केस ऑफ बोन्स it is not very large, and the object is known as brittle, and bones are known as basically brittle because they will break very easily when you cross the yield point. So this is all about stress strain curve. Now I'm summarizing all these points which I have explained to you by curve. So here they are. So the elastic strain region where the plastic region of the stress strain curve are divided by yield point. And what is yield point? Yield point is an imaginary boundary or point above which stress causes permanent damage. So above Y there will be permanent damage to the bone structure. This permanent damage is called plastic deformation. Technically एक term दी गई. So what is plastic deformation? Plastic deformation is that point at which is beyond the your yield point, where stress has caused permanent damage to your bone structure. Bone cannot be restored after Y point or yield point. So that is known as plastic deformation. Third point, the amount of post yield strain that occurs in a material before fracture. Yield point के बाद जितना वो curve खींचेगा, that is the point. The amount of post yield strain that occurs in the material before fracture, fracture होने से पहले, is known as ductility of the material. And the bones have poor ductility. I've told you before, because वो ज़्यादा bones नहीं खींचने वाले. जैसे ही yield point आएगा, you will lose, the bone will fracture very soon. On the other hand, if the material is ductile, जैसे कोई प्लास्टिक होता है जिसको आप खींच सकते हैं बहुत ज़्यादा डिफॉर्म करके, so that will have some longer strain area. Otherwise, it will break. So bones will break because bones have poor ductility. Number four, the opposite of ductility is known as brittleness. So bones are brittle basically, and they have high brittleness. A material that sustain very little post yield strain. So ये bone की feature है. Bone sustain very little post yield strain, and then fracture will happen. And the last point is toughness. What is toughness of a bone? The area under stress strain curve is known as, is tell you the amount of energy you need to cause fracture, and this property is known as toughness. So toughness क्या है? Toughness is basically energy you need to break your bones, in simple line. Okay, I repeat, the area under stress curve will give you the measure of the energy which is required to cause fracture in the bone, and this property of the material or the property of the bone is known as toughness. Okay, so these are the all key points of stress strain curve. So always keep this in mind. So it is very important with regard to biomechanics. So next figure is also the same thing in the curve way. In the curved manner, we have shown you the difference between the brittle and the ductile materials. So again, we have the same curve to show you the differences between the different materials. So just focus on the ductile blue curve. So in the blue curve, you can see. So here we have yield point. Up to this, we have elastic region. After this, we have plastic region. So in the blue curve, you can see the maximum length. So it can deform up to this point, and then fracture will come. So these kind of materials are known as ductile materials. And the brittle ones, ये देखिए brittle one black, solid black. ये जैसे yield point आता है उसके बाद it will break. No lengthening after yield point. Fracture will happen. Bones are on the dash because to some extent जो आपको मैंने बताया spongy side होता है तो उस वजह से थोड़ा सा ये आगे तक जा सकता है but not too much. So it will break very soon as compared to ductile materials. So this is just to show you the differences between the different materials, how they behave on stress strain curve or load deformation curve or force length curve. So तीन नाम है, always keep in this in mind. Okay, so this is all about force length curve or stress strain curve. Now coming to another definition or word you have always I think आपने सुना होगा, young modulus. So what is young modulus? So this slide will tell you what is young modulus. Young modulus is basically a measure of a solid's stiffness, how stiff a material is. If you talk of bones, how stiff a bone is. So that is defined by young modulus value. Or we can say that it is a resistance to elastic deformation. वो opposite हो गया ना, जो stiff होगा वो elastic कम होगा, ठीक है. So the basic principle is that a materials undergo elastic deformation when it is compressed or extended, returning to original shape when the load is removed. So this is the elastic property. जो elastic है जिसको आप deform करेंगे जब आपने deformation को force को छोड़ा, it will come back to original shape. So this principle is known as elasticity. Now young modulus will define कि material elastic है या नहीं है. So this is a value which will let you know about the material. It is elastic or solid, it is stiff or less stiff. So more deformation occurs in the flexible materials as compared to stiff materials. So value से कैसे पता लगेगा? If the young modulus value is less, if the value of young modulus is less, that means the material is elastic. On the other hand, if the value of young modulus is high, that means the material is solid, stiffer. So bones have high young modulus values. So that defines that they are very stiff and they don't have much elasticity. And the SI unit is of a young model is Pascal, and we usually measure it in the megapascals or gigapascals depending on the value. So this is all about young modulus. Now coming to another property of bone, which is known as bone anisotropy. Let the slides change on your screens. Yeah. So bone is basically anisotropic. Anisotropic, it is a property which tells you that materials behave differently on different areas. So why? Because they have different compositions, different composition variable. Because bone has variable composition, you know, on one on the ends it is spongy from inside, and main shaft is made of that compact bone, strong bone. So it has variable composition. So because of that, bone is anisotropic. So materials like bone that have different properties in different directions are known as anisotropic. So due to this, young modulus values भी bones के ऊपर different है, variable है. For example, young modulus varies with direction. For example, young modulus in the mid shaft, middle में अगर आप देखेंगे, of the long bone, it is around 70 gigapascals in the longitudinal direction. And on the other hand, if you go to transverse section, at that it is 12 GPa. So when it is 17 GPa, that means bone is more stiffer, and when it is 12 GPa, that means in the transverse direction it has less stiffness. So the probability of fractures are more when forces strike the areas where you have less young modulus. तो ट्रांसफर साइड पे यूजली वो हमारे टोरिजन वाले स्ट्रेस shear stresses usually happen at these places. So that is a biomechanical reason why bones have less shear stress ability, less shear strength because of young modulus. And why it is there? So because bone has variable bone composition, it is different in different parts. So that is the reason bone cannot withstand shear stresses, because at those because shear stresses usually strike at the areas usually in the transfer direction, and their young modulus value is less. Okay, so bone is strongest along long axis. So this is the point. Now another biomechanical property, due to variability, due to variable nature of composition of bones, we have this viscoelastic response from the bones. What is the meaning of viscoelastic? So behavior of bone is dependent on rate of load, rate of force, कितनी जल्दी force आपके bone को strike कर रही है. So this is the again stress strain curve. तो इसमें आपको clear हो जाएगा, if the rate of application of force is very fast, बहुत ज़्यादा strikes कर रहे हैं फटाफट, and second curve below one shows you the slow force, which is not happening much. So the fracture will happen more when load applied is slow. So that is the viscoelastic property of bones. And why so? Because of variability in the composition of bones. So this is another aspect of your bone due to different composition. Now the last section here on the bones, we have different types of fractures due to different stresses. So that will conclude you. So now I'll discuss main fractures which you come across in your sports. So first one are these are very least found, and these are known as compressive loading fractures, and these are basically known as cervical fractures or lumbar fractures. So cervical fractures are basically spine loaded through lead, and like football, diving, gymnastics. So these are the main games where you will find these kind of injuries. And second one is lumbar fractures. These are mainly common in your weightlifters or gymnasts. So that's it. These are the two main kinds of fractures which we see in this category. Then due to tensile loading, due to tensile stress, tension stress, which is usually applied by muscles. So let the slide chain. So these are the compressive which you can see. So tensile loading are basically main source of tensile load is your muscles. So tension can stimulate tissue growth also. That is a different part. But if you do excess of muscle pulling, so that will lead to sprains, strains, inflammation, and fractures of due to this kind is known as this evolution. And this is one of the example of tibial tuber porosity you can see here. So it is experienced when the excessive loads are applied, and excessive pulling will result in this kind of problem in the bones. So it is basically a round elevation, a bump is there in the bone due to excessive tensile loading by the muscle. Another example is Osgood Scatterer's disease, which is usually due to excessive pulling by your quadriceps. So these are examples of tensile loading. Now another picture will show you basically example of epiphyseal plate fracture. And this epiphyseal fracture basically due to shear stresses, and these are very common in games, these kind of fracture. These are, so it is created by application of compressive tensile or combination of loads, and it is on the transverse side where you have seen that young modulus is less and the bone has high chance of fracture. So these are very common, and the example is shown of fractured epiphyseal plate here. It could be due to some push off by something or some ball applicant, anything which can strike with great force there. So that these kind of fractures are common, very common in the games. Another aspect is bending forces. You can see this is another pictorial you can see here the bending stresses causing bending of your bones. So that is also very common in the games basically. So these are all different kinds of shear stresses which you face in the games, and these are the ones which lead to maximum fractures. And the last one is your torsional forces, which are due to rapid twisting force is responsible for these kind of torsional forces which twist happens, and it can happen in many games. And again, this is a type of shear stress, and that will at that part bone is very fragile, and it can lead to a lot of fractures. Spiral fracture can develop from this load. Example, technical term is spiral fracture, we call it. So this was all about bones biomechanical properties and its limitations, and that's it from today. Thank you very much, and please share your experience, and if you have any question you can ask or WhatsApp in the group, no problem. Hope it is clear now. Thank you very much. Welcome Narendra, welcome Sai, welcome Sai, welcome all. Hope bone is clear now in your minds.